BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech. For biotech companies striving to bring innovative therapies to market and maximize patient impact, IQVIA Biotech is the trusted CRO of choice. Backed by 25 years of unparalleled experience and deep therapeutic expertise, our full-service clinical development solutions are purpose-built to accelerate success. IQVIA Biotech helps early-stage biotechs de-risk by developing strategic clinical development plans, guiding drug candidates along the most promising pathways. Leverage data-driven models and dynamic tools to craft a compelling value story, attract investment, and maintain momentum through every phase of drug development.
Last week, public disclosure that a Sarepta gene therapy had caused a third death led FDA to ask the company to stop distributing its DMD gene therapy, a move the biotech company has resisted. The deaths and disputes between FDA and Sarepta raise questions about the future of AAV gene therapies. The therapy, ELEVIDYS, was the first and only gene therapy approved for the fatal neuromuscular disease. On the latest BioCentury This Week podcast, BioCentury's analysts take a look at what the death means for the future of gene therapy. Plus, at long last, FDA has selected a new director for CDER. What do we know about Stanford's George Tidmarsh? We'll also take a look at some numbers out of the world of venture financing for biotechs. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury podcast are my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
And Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Okay, Steve, I want to jump right to you. A lot has happened in the past few days between FDA and Sarepta regarding ELEVIDYS since the disclosure of the third death of a patient in a Sarepta gene therapy trial. Can you bring us up to speed?
So on July 16, that would be last Wednesday, Sarepta announced a major reorganization, laying off 500 employees, about 36% of its workforce, and shifting its focus toward early-stage siRNA projects. It also updated ELEVIDYS's label and adding a black box warning that's similar to labels that are on other AAV gene vectors, warning about potential liver toxicity and fatal liver adverse effects. On Thursday evening, BioCentury reported that there had been a third death in a Sarepta trial that has never been disclosed previously. It was a 52-year-old man who was in a trial of a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy gene therapy from Sarepta. It uses the same vector as Sarepta's DMD therapy. The next day, other reporters picked up on that, expanded it, and investors picked up on it also. There was a lot of controversy. Sarepta issued a statement, had an analyst Q&A. In the statement and the Q&A, they defended their decision to not disclose the third death previously. So on Friday, there were several actions that came out of FDA. They placed a hold on all of Sarepta's limb-girdle muscular dystrophy trials. They asked Sarepta to stop distributing ELEVIDYS to any patients. The company, which had announced earlier in the week that it was going to stop shipping ELEVIDYS to non-ambulatory patients because there had been 2 previous deaths of non-ambulatory DMD patients, refused to stop shipping ELEVIDYS on a voluntary basis to ambulatory Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients. FDA also revoked the platform designation for the vector that's used in Sarepta's limb-girdle muscular dystrophy gene therapies and in ELEVIDYS. So that's where we are today.
Where to start with all of this? I think in a minute, I'm going to bring in Selena. Let's talk a little bit about the implications for gene therapies and AAV vectors. I don't think you've said that it's an AAV vector. But first of all, just clarify for those who haven't spent the weekend on Twitter or X or wherever they're getting their information, what is the reason that it hadn't been disclosed? I understand that Sarepta said it's not materially relevant. How has this come to light now? And it seems in a way that this third very, very unfortunate death has actually just catapulted the whole company into a new phase. I mean, it was clearly, as you say, it was having layoffs and things. It was clearly in some trouble, but it just seems to have compounded it. Can you talk about that?
Okay, so how's it come out now? It came out now because I found out about it and reported it. If I hadn't found out about it and reported it, probably somebody else would have, and it would have come out, but certainly not at the time that it did. The company had no intention to make it public. The companies reported it to FDA. So Sarepta told FDA that there was an acute liver failure case that was life-threatening. They reported that on June 20, 2025. That was from their phase 1 trial of a limb-girdle muscular dystrophy therapy. And they followed up and notified FDA of the death on July 3, 2025. On Thursday morning, Sarepta informed patient advocates of that death, but they didn't announce it publicly. When I found out about it and asked the company about it, they said that they had no intention, or no timing anyway, of making a public disclosure of that death. And in their calls with analysts, they said that they hadn't disclosed it previously and that it wasn't material because they had already announced their intention to discontinue that gene therapy. I should also note that Doug Ingram, the CEO of Sarepta, said on that call that the fatal events associated with their gene therapies were very, very rare. And in my conversations with patient advocates, with mothers of children who've had DMD, they were very concerned by that comment. There have been about 140 non-ambulatory patients who've received Elevidys, and 2 of them have died. The limb-girdle therapy that caused a death, that was in a phase 1 trial. There were 4 patients in that trial, and 1 died. That doesn't really meet most people's definition of very, very rare.
So I think something that you wrote about in your story, which I thought got to the heart of it, is what parents of the patients who've been on these therapies are going through right now, given what you've talked about are not incredibly long odds. I wouldn't call them short odds, but they are quite serious odds. I don't know exactly the time course from when a patient is given the gene therapy that this kind of toxicity might arise, but maybe you can just channel what you're hearing from the patient community in terms of what they're going through.
Well, one of the parents told me that living with a child who's received this gene therapy is a 24/7 panic attack. The timing is several weeks to months after receiving the therapy. We don't know how many non-ambulatory patients have received Elevidys a month, 2 months, 3 months out, but some of them certainly have. Roche in June said that worldwide there have been about 140 to 150 boys who are non-ambulatory who'd received the therapy since its approval in the United States, since its accelerated approval for the non-ambulatory population. That's how many non-ambulatory patients have received it. Given the fact that there's always a lag between an approval and when gene therapies start to get distributed, it's quite likely that a substantial portion of those would have been in the last year, certainly. And that's got to be causing, and it is causing, that's what advocates told me, it is causing a great deal of anxiety among the families of the boys who've received it.
Selena, maybe you want to jump in now. Perhaps you can extend this conversation to the implications for AAV gene therapies more broadly and that technology.
Yeah, well, liver toxicity from AAV gene therapies, that's a known risk, right? This is not new. And it really has nothing to do with whether a patient is ambulatory or whether they can no longer walk, right? There's not a biological connection to that distinction. It's like some false shorthand. So what we know from gene therapies of the past and from this gene therapy is that it's about dose and it's about the state of somebody's liver before they receive the gene therapy. So older patients who have grown more and weigh more tend to be non-ambulatory, right? And they need higher doses. I don't know if anybody remembers, but 4 or 5 years ago, Astellas reported 4 patient deaths in a gene therapy trial for a different severe rare disease that causes progressive muscle weakening, right? That was X-linked myotubular myopathy. And those were very young patients, but that disease, over time, it involves the liver. So what they realized there is, okay, well, if you're having some kind of liver dysfunction before, it's probably not a great therapy for you. But now in that case, they tracked the 20 patients who lived for a couple of years, and they found out it was highly effective. You had all of those patients where none of them could sit unassisted before that trial. All of them were on ventilators. Something like 3/4 of them came off ventilators. All of them could sit up, and some of them could even walk unassisted. In a scenario like that, when you take all of that in, you're like, are the risks worth the benefits? Maybe, but Elevidys doesn't have the luxury of really strong efficacy data like that. But when it comes to future of gene therapies, what does it mean? It means we need to take stock of all of these gene therapies, right? Not just this one, and think about what have we learned across the board about, are there thresholds for pre-existing liver tox? Are there thresholds for weight and dose that can guide who can successfully, who has that lowest risk and are the best candidates for receiving benefit from gene therapies?
The thing about this one that's so disheartening is that not only were these deaths predictable, but they were predicted, right? It was anticipated that this could happen when Elevidys was approved for the non-ambulatory population, which, as you say, that again, it's not about the fact that they're non-ambulatory, it's the fact that they're older, they've had the disease longer, they're larger, and they need larger doses. But it was predicted that this was a major safety risk, and they went ahead with it anyway. FDA went ahead with it, the company went ahead with it. And also it has to be pointed out that there was little, if any, efficacy data in the non-ambulatory population to support a risk-benefit calculation.
Steve, I wanted to ask you, so we know today from the SEC filing of Sarepta that FDA has withdrawn its platform designation for AAV that it had granted not that long ago, actually. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about what you would have wanted to see from FDA on this whole front related to this particular finding, and then what you would like to see from them going forward on this.
Well, first, I think they need to have a lot more transparency. This administration talks a lot about transparency. They need to have a lot more transparency around their decision-making here. In the statement that they put out, they being FDA, on Friday, they referenced new safety information that it caused them to take the actions that they took. Well, there doesn't seem to be a good case for saying it was new. They knew about this some time ago. The only thing that seems to have been new is the fact that the rest of us found out about it, and there was a lot of concern that was raised. So I think there needs to be a lot more transparency around that. And then I think there also needs to be transparency around the approval of the platform designation for Sarepta for this gene therapy vector. Why did FDA do it? What was the process that they went through in thinking about it? And how are they going to think about this platform designation going forward? What are the kind of criteria that they're going to apply for determining what products should get it, what products shouldn't get it? And then finally, I'd say, speaking to what Selena said, the other really big concern is there going to be an overreaction here by FDA, by regulators, and almost certainly by investors? And is that going to jeopardize the whole field of gene therapy in ways that arguably aren't necessary, and that in some ways, mimic what happened in the past when we had a tragic death, Jesse Gelsinger's death, that really set the field back for a decade? There was really a decade where there was impossible to do R&D or to get any investment in the field. I think that would be just as tragic as having these deaths that have happened that were avoidable.
And then there's a whole host of companies who are trying very hard to solve the problem of gene therapies, just getting stuck in the liver. They're trying to bypass the liver and really concentrate gene therapies in the target organ they're interested in. It would be a shame if that research were unfundable, because that's the solution we need for this. I just wonder if there were some investigation into all of these gene therapies so far that was comprehensive and got into the nitty-gritty, if it might guide us a little bit in how much detargeting of liver would be a sufficient amount to avoid most of the toxicity. Can we get any insight into that?
And I think this is a case where really the industry, academics, the patient community, the regulators, and not just in the United States, but around the world, should come together and ask that question and other questions, and then plot a strategy for answering those questions.
Yeah. And then on the platform thing, I don't know. It's possible that the platform designation just isn't going to apply. anywhere. I mean, Peter Marks had said before he left, he didn't think AAVs were a good use case. Even though you can apply that same vector to other therapies, there's so much bespoke design that happens in the whole thing, like the combination of the cargo and the vector and whatnot. And so he had pointed to gene editing therapies delivered in LNPs as possibly the one place where this designation could shine. But, we'll have to wait and see. It's not looking like there's going to be a large number of relevant use cases.
Steve, final thoughts here?
I think that this is a case where we're really going to have to see whether the patient community, FDA, and industry, whether everybody can resist the urge to simply point fingers at everyone else and plot a good path forward. And there's a lot at stake. And you can't forget that it's right in front of our face, right? The patients, the boys who have DMD, still need safe, effective therapies. It's still a relentless and terrible disease that needs to be treated urgently. There needs to be urgent steps to develop products that are going to help them. And there are so many other diseases that potentially could benefit from gene therapy, that what's really, really needed now is this kind of overarching attempt to plot a safe and scientifically responsible path forward to be able to use what's arguably could be, tremendously important therapy. And in other conditions, of course, gene therapy has been tremendously effective and safe and has saved lives.
Okay, and that, of course, is the subject of Steve's editor's commentary that we published on Friday. You can find that at biocenturypodcast.com. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to turn to FDA and learn about the new CDER director.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
We're back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Appreciate you tuning in. And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe and leave us a comment or a question, and we'll try to respond on an upcoming episode. Okay, on Monday, FDA Commissioner Marty Makary named Stanford cancer biologist George Tidmarsh as the new head of the agency's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Tidmarsh completed training at Stanford in pediatric oncology and neonatology and is adjunct faculty of pediatrics and neonatology, is founding co-director of Stanford's Master of Translational Research and Applied Medicine program. He's also founded and been CEO of multiple biopharmas, including Horizon, which Amgen acquired for $28 billion a couple of years back. Tidmarsh succeeds Jacqueline Corrigan-Curry, the now former acting director of CDER, post she held since January when Patricia Cavazzoni stepped down from the position. Steve, of course, as everyone knows, you follow FDA quite closely. What are you hearing about Dr. Tidmarsh?
It's really interesting. First, the name came out of the blue. It really surprised a lot of people. It surprised people, senior people at FDA and people who watch FDA closely. He has, as you mentioned, he has deep experience developing drugs in industry. He's trained as a pediatric oncologist. The other thing that you have to know about him is that he's been a very, very strong and adamant supporter of anti-establishment perspectives on COVID-19. And really, with Dr. Makary, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the HHS secretary, everything seems to come back to COVID-19 in one way or another. But more on his resume. Okay, so you mentioned that he has worked in biopharma. He was president and CEO of La Jolla Pharmaceutical. When he was there, he helped discover and develop an angiotensin II drug for the treatment of shock that was approved. He was founder and CEO of Horizon Pharma. As you mentioned, Horizon was sold to Amgen for $28 billion. He also founded a company called Threshold Pharmaceuticals, and he's held senior positions at Coulter Pharmaceuticals, which was acquired by GlaxoSmithKline, Sequus, and other companies. He led clinical development of Bexar and Doxil, two FDA anti-cancer drugs. He's also known, as I said, for his anti-establishment views on COVID. He's very close personally with Dr. Makary, with Vinay Prasad, the CBER director, and with Jay Bhattacharya, the NIH director. He's praised Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He wrote something just a month ago where he attacked former CBER director Peter Marks and said that Makary and Kennedy were right to have forced Marks to resign. He attacked him in particular on his policies on COVID and also on what we were just talking about, on Marx's policies on Elevidus. More recently, in April, he published a paper calling for a reevaluation of the use of talc in pharmaceuticals and in other products. That paper was published in a journal that Bhattacharya and Makary founded. Interestingly, the paper was submitted on April 9, was published on April 10, which doesn't suggest that there was a traditional kind of peer review. And he's been very active in the last couple of years on the Stanford campus. He put up the money to pay for a conference last year about COVID issues, and he moderated one of the panels there. Makary, Scott Atlas, who was a very controversial figure in COVID, Prasad and others spoke at that conference. One of the things that I found that was really interesting in Tidmarsh's comments at the conference is that it seemed to suggest that he has views about the off-label promotion of drugs. He didn't actually come out and say that, but in some of his questions, it seemed to me that he was suggesting that he believes that FDA has been too restrictive in regulating off-label comments that drug companies have made. Which is interesting because all of the COVID issues really aren't terribly relevant to CDER. Vaccines come under CDER. But if you think about how has his experience in this anti-establishment COVID world, how is that going to color or affect the decisions that he makes at CDER? You could imagine that it might happen around speech issues in general, promotion of off-label ideas, off-label truthful and non-misleading off-label information can be interesting. Just wrapping up, one other thing that he said that I found interesting when he was kind of talking about his philosophy or the way that he looks at the world, he talked a lot about the fact that some medicines started out as fringe ideas, things that people laughed at and didn't think were reasonable, and then they ended up being approved and proved right. In some cases, people got Nobel Prizes for them. So it leads me to think that he's going to bring that kind of thinking to CDER.
It's interesting, Steve, because as you point out, so much of it seems to just always come back to COVID. And I say that because there's also a thread in some of the HHS new officials that is quite industry adverse or industry suspicious. But that doesn't seem to be the case here with Dr. Tidmarsh. He's, as Jeff pointed out, he's been a CEO several times. He's been quite in this interface. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that sort of tension plays out. Clearly, as you say, he's a favor of what you might call the serendipity, or the ones that everybody didn't believe, and they're the ones who bring the goods in the end, and being more open to that, which I think a lot of people might think that FDA could be more open. There's also this slight grievance-oriented, we were treated badly in COVID, nobody listened to us in COVID, angle that seems to be coloring and maybe dominant among the new heads. How do you think about that?
It's interesting, that related to that, there's a lot of tensions, right, in the way that the Trump administration thinks about FDA and public health in general. And one of the tensions is between, praising the biopharmaceutical industry, wanting to promote it, saying that FDA, Commissioner Makary has said many times that he thinks that FDA should get out of the way of industry, that it has been too restrictive. And on the other hand, he and HHS Secretary Kennedy really vilify industry And they say that the big pharma's corrupted FDA, that they've corrupted medical journals, that they've done all kinds of things that Kennedy and Macri think are nefarious. And Kennedy said that FDA in the past has been a sock puppet for industry. So it's really interesting that Macri reached out to someone who has got more experience, I think, at a higher level in industry, certainly than anyone else who's ever run CDER. And I actually would be hard pressed to find anybody who's ever worked at FDA who's had the kind of senior positions and been involved in the development of so many drugs as Tidmarsh. And it's interesting also because among RFK Jr. supporters, the MAHA movement, there's already a kind of a backlash. If you look at their websites and listen to their podcasts, some of them are highly critical, for example, of Vinay Prasad, and say that he's not adhering to the precepts of the MAHA movement, and they've urged Macri to get rid of him, which I think is extraordinarily unlikely to happen. Macri seems to be really delighted with Prasad. And the other thing to think about, I think, two things. One is this appointment and Prasad's appointment, they represent a kind of politicization of the leadership of these centers. There's always been a political element to it, but I think that this makes it much more explicitly so. And it makes me wonder how long their tenures are going to be. If there's a new commissioner who has a different political agenda and views the world differently, is that commissioner going to change out the center directors? Traditionally, that hasn't happened, but we've seen a lot of tradition go right out the window recently. So it'll be very interesting to see whether that's the case here.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. And Steve's story you'll be able to find at biocenturypodcast.com. And we will be closely watching how things shake out at CDER. Let's do a little finance. BioCentury's Stephen Hansen recently completed his look at the third quarter public markets, his preview of the third quarter public markets for biotech. You can catch up on that by tuning into last week's BioCentury This Week podcast. And on the heels of that, last week, our Director of Research, Meredith Durkin-Wolf, assessed how venture financing has been in the first half of the year. Selena, you edited that and so much more while I was off traipsing around Spain, eating pinchos and tapas and drinking cava, and
taking a well-deserved
reluctantly
break
coming
there.
back. What did you learn?
Yeah, well, these were, we published a couple of what we call data bites. These are just small bites, one chart each, a little bit of dialogue. And the first one I looked at just total venture, any series, any disclosed venture in the first half of the year compared to the first half of 2024 or 23, et cetera, going back to 2016. And I think the big thing that stood out to me was that the number of venture rounds was the lowest in that 10-year period. So there was a slowdown in the raising of rounds. It was not the smallest first half in that time period for the amount raised. 2016 and 2017 were lower, but that's because it seems the average round size was bigger, which may not be surprising if you've been following our coverage for a while. It's, the IPO window remains pretty much closed. Companies have to stay private for longer, and investors are kind of sometimes forced to pick winners and to keep funding those and keep those companies moving along private. So that could be one factor behind that observation.
Interesting, Selena. I know Meredith also took a look at seed and Series A financings, and curious what we learned there.
Yeah, similar but different. So if you look at, again, the number of seed and Series A rounds in the first half versus other first halves, it's just been going down and down and down since 2021, with 25's first half being the smallest in the 10 years. Okay, so that part is the same. But the amount raised in the first half actually was more than in 2024. It was pretty healthy. And then when she looked, into the individual rounds and figured, trying to figure this out, it seems that 25% of the total raised came from 4 companies. So mega rounds, these continue to be a trend. We keep seeing them. So we recorded in BioCentury 35 CDER Series A rounds of at least 200 million in the past decade.
Wow.
4 of them occurred in the first half of 2025. So that was tying the first half of 23 for the most in any half year. And it was the largest total from those big mega rounds.
And what's a mega round? Is
In
that
this
100
case,
million or where
in this case, it was 200 million or over.
We're doing 200 million
Yeah.
now. Yeah. Back in the day, it was 100 million.
Yeah, right. Mega getting bigger.
So yeah, even it's interesting. Even in these, obviously very difficult times for financing, it's good to see that the early stage companies still getting funded.
Yeah, well, I think the take home is fewer of them are getting funded,
Yep.
but the ones who are getting funded are getting funded for a longer runway, just because that's what it takes.
Interesting. Okay, well, those data bites up on biocenturypodcast.com or biocentury.com. If you're a subscriber, you can go there and access that. And appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back next week as usual. And later this week, don't forget to turn into our sister podcast. Later this week, we'll have President and CEO John Lepore of Profound Therapeutics in conversation with Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how IQVIA Biotech can help you turn your vision into venture capital, go to IQVIAbiotech.com/visionaries.